I'm Mark Gagan and you're listening to the Voice of Insurance podcast, produced in association with Advantage Go. Release your underwriters to underwrite with Advantage Go's underwriting platform. Today's episode is a masterclass with two leaders in the North American professional liability market. Often on this show we talk about the big picture in very broad brushstrokes, but today is refreshing because we're getting into specific and specialist detail about some of the most broad-reaching and dynamic classes of business anywhere in the world. Danielle Librizzi, Head of Professional Liability, and Chris Cooper, Head of Media Liability at QBE North America, have a lifetime of market experience between them, and this is a lively and rewarding discussion. Casualty is under the spotlight the world over, but nowhere more so than in North America, so these two senior underwriters are right at the front line in the battle to keep on top of new perils and trends in the world's fastest moving and highest stakes market. Here I ask what Danielle makes of casualty rate adequacy, and I ask Chris how the pandemic, the trend to digital platforms and the writers' strike have affected the media liability risk landscape. How is QBE's professional liability division responding to the call for the globalization of QBE's offering and far greater collaboration between departments? And how is QBE utilizing artificial intelligence on the ground in its own underwriting processes? And perhaps more importantly, how does Chris view it as an emerging media liability and potentially systemic general E&O peril? I got all the answers I was looking for, and if you stay tuned, so will you. Danielle and Chris are excellent company, and this will be a very rewarding listen for anyone wanting to get a better perspective on the North American professional liability market. Enjoy the podcast. Danielle and Chris, welcome to the Voice of Insurance.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Thanks for having us.
Why don't you just briefly, for anyone who's listening who doesn't know you, why don't you just briefly introduce yourselves, give us a history of your careers to date and how you got to be in your current role. Why don't we start with you, Danielle?
Okay. Danielle Librizzi. I head up professional liability for North America for QBE. I am an attorney by trade. I didn't practice very long, and so found myself on the claim side of financial lines for most of my career. In 2015, I made the move over to the underwriting side, wanted to learn more about the business, and then came over to QBE in December of 2020 and really enjoy working on the professional liability book here where we're growing.
It's great that after seeing that everything that can go wrong with professional liability, you still had the optimistic nature to want to go and then continue to underwrite business. That was good to see.
Yes, I think everybody should spend a little time on the claim side.
Absolutely. I was very lucky. When I was a broker, it was in a very small broking house, so we kind of had to broker a lot of our own claims, or at least if you wanted a renewal done and there was a lot of pending claims that hadn't been notified yet, you really, really need to help. So yes, I would recommend it to anybody. Chris, your turn.
I am the leader of our media liability book in North America, as well as the leader of our middle market professional liability book, which is anything under 100 million revenue or under 100 attorneys. I started my career about 20 years ago. I was a trainee with Chubb as a media liability and miscellaneous E&O specialist. I spent about 10 years with them in Connecticut, Los Angeles, and Chicago. I did a brief stint at Taurus. I was hired there to start a media liability practice. That didn't last very long. I got an offer from QBE to basically recreate what I had done at Taurus at a larger brand, larger insurance company, better balance sheet at the time, better opportunity. And that was around 10 years ago. And so I started doing a media liability practice here at QBE, and the role has kind of grown to encompass the other lines.
And so another graduate of the University of Chubb. It's either some speed, Chubb or AIG.
Right.
And also with Taurus, that was a business that we've all long since forgotten about. But yeah, I spent a lot of time writing about it as it was an interesting startup with interesting backing at the time. But it didn't quite work out. But I suppose bits of its DNA are still with us.
Yeah, absolutely.
Also, another thing, Chris, I love it when we talk about miscellaneous. Anyone who's got miscellaneous in their job title has got to be a friend of mine, I'd say, because it's
all the stuff that falls outside of it.
I was thinking, well, because I feel most of the things I do have usually fit into the category of miscellaneous in some way. My career, doing a podcast, I suppose that's definitely media these days, but it's kind of more the miscellaneous end of anything. That's where I tend to find myself. So you've found a kindred spirit.
Yeah, absolutely.
So Danielle, you're running these operations. Give us a bit of a sense of that size of QBE's professional liability operations across the US. What sort of gross written premium and headcount are we talking about?
So for our team, we're about $250 million in gross written premium. and we are 40 underwriters and growing. So we really are slated for growth in all of our core products within professional liability. We've got lawyers, professional liability. We've got the miscellaneous professional liability. We've got the media book. We do cyber and E&O. And most recently, last year, we started really pushing into the cyber standalone space as part of our global cyber initiative.
And so as you're strategizing, what is the plan that you've made? How do you go to market? What do you want the brokers to know you for? And any parts of the market or segments of the market, because it's such a big market, that you're particularly interested in attacking?
We want our brokers to know us as specialists. And so we really focus on those core products that we do really, really well. I know miscellaneous people will say miscellaneous is anything, but we really focus on 10 to 12 industries within that miscellaneous book so that we can really build the specialization. The team is broken up into those specializations, although we are one team and we work across all those specializations to be able to bring something unique to the market lots of times, where it might be a media risk that has unique professional liability angle, or it could be the broker comes to us looking for cyber, but they realize they've got this E&O that other carriers may not be willing to touch or may not be willing to blend with cyber. Those are the things that we're really good at and we can bring value to the market. That's not to say we don't want to just continue to grow our LPL, and we definitely are so focused on our global cyber initiative, but there's a lot of value that I think that QBE brings that other carriers don't bring.
LPL? What does that stand for?
We're professional liability.
Oh, right. Yes, absolutely. Yes. Well, I suppose in the UK, we talk about solicitors. We talk about solicitors PI, and that's why. So there you go. LPL. Well, that must be a very big market as well. I mean, absolutely.
It's a very large market. We have a really nice share of the market. We are seen as specialists in that market. And our European counterparts write a lot of solicitors as well. So we work really closely with them.
QBE Europe certainly has been very well known as being a leading market for that for decades. So it's specialists rather than generalists.
Yes.
And at the moment, you've hinted at this, but where's the most of that growth going to come from when you're sitting in your budget meeting and CEOs and senior people are looking down and saying, right, Daniel, where's the growth going to come for next year?
So we hope that we're going to grow in all of our core, but I think the biggest part of our growth is going to come from cyber over the next couple of years, just because QBE's invested a significant amount in just bringing the organization together, bringing some tools to the underwriters, and just really wanting to be able to bring that to the market for our partners.
Your CEO does have a certain amount of expertise in growing a cyber book.
He does. And it was really great when he joined QBE and wanted to focus on that. It got a lot of people at QBE really excited about what we could do over the next couple of years.
What I always find fascinating about any kind of professional risk, professional liability risk, professional indemnity, E&O risk, is that they're always quite fast moving, that there are always new sets of demand. For example, podcast E&O or libel and slander cover wouldn't have been really a thing 10 years ago because the podcast didn't exist. So how do you go about measuring where unmet demand might be in the marketplace? You just rely on brokers to come and say, hey, here's a new problem that no one's been able to solve yet.
We spend a lot of time with our broker partners, but I think for us, we've got a lot of insureds out there. So we ask them directly, what is it that you're worried about that you haven't been able to solve with insurance and you think that insurance can help you? May not solve the full problem, but it can actually either do a risk transfer or be able to come up with some sort of solution that helps them get to where they're willing to go. So it's a lot of conversation with our customers, who we consider both the end insureds and our broker partners.
And where are you sensing that most of that worry is coming from at the moment? You said the cyber, definitely cyber. Is it still just keeps growing as a worry?
Cyber keeps growing as a worry. Emerging technologies like AI is something that has been coming up just because insureds want to know what we think about it. They want to use it as a tool. Just like all new tools come out, we're looking for ways to be able to become more efficient, to become better at what we do. And so that plays into E&O all the time. Media content is definitely changing the way we ingest content, the way our customers create content. So those are, I would say, the three things that we hear the most.
Well, I've got a whole segment on AI, which we're going to talk about a bit later. But I suppose Chris has been very patient waiting to be able to tell us all about what he does. So Chris, tell us about the Media Liability division. How big is that market and what sort of share do you have? You have quite a big team, don't you?
Yeah, so we have 15 underwriters that are dedicated to media liability, whether that's entertainment focused business like our video and film team, where they underwrite individual productions or seasons of television shows. There's some music in there, there's promoters in there. That's a dedicated department for us with a very specialized broker set where we have a long history of being able to come up with creative solutions for more difficult productions, really being able to underwrite to the specific exposure each film might have. And it takes a lot of dedication and expertise. We focus on a lot of middle market broadcasters and publishers. We do a lot of podcasts like yourself. And then we have a group of underwriters who really focus on the large media companies over $1 billion, where it's a mix of cyber, technology E&O, some miscellaneous E&O, but it's really a media company at heart. And I feel like we fill a need in the marketplace for underwriters who really understand that core exposure of copyright, defamation, invasion of privacy from a information gathering and news gathering perspective, right of publicity type issues. It's something that our underwriters are really interested in, really passionate about. The domestic United States media liability market, it's tough to say because so much is put into cyber towers. There's some media liability that's in cyber towers, whether it's a media company or not, or it's a big company like Alphabet, where they own YouTube and they have Google Play and everything like that. They have a huge media exposure, or Yahoo, which has a huge media exposure, but they're really cyber towers. I would say $250 million is really the marketplace for media liability, media company media liability in the United States. I feel like we probably have a little under a quarter of that business at this point.
That's really interesting. So you probably feel that you get shown most things.
Yeah, I feel like we are a go-to market at this point for large, midsize, and small business.
Well, how's the nature of that risk changing? Because, of course, we've been talking, media is changing so fast. This digitization of media, 10 years ago, none of us had Netflix. It is pretty amazing. And now that this is probably one of the largest film producers in the world, and Amazon and everybody else, my local movie theater, cinema, is just not what it used to be. If you don't go on the first day that it comes out, it's probably going to be on the TV at home 2 or 3 days later, if you're not quick enough, if you don't want to see it on a big screen. And how's it affecting everything? And obviously we've had a big strike and you had the pandemic.
Right.
How did that change things for that nature of that risk?
The digitization part, let's talk about that first. Let's take AI off the table because we're going to talk about that a little bit later, artificial intelligence. So when I started my career, we were talking about how the internet has changed everything and now everyone is a publisher. So the runway for media liability was unlimited. The same mentality still really works. I mean, everyone really is with social media at this point. Everyone has a marketing department that is running their own social media. Everyone has their own form of content that they're putting out in order to entice people to buy their product or watch their other product. The exposures themselves, the core really still copyright, trademark, defamation, invasion of privacy, right of publicity, right? The exposures themselves haven't necessarily changed, but the acceleration, like that theatrical window, the shortening of the theatrical window that you're talking about, it does create other things that you have to think about when you're underwriting in terms of the various partners that are involved in the creation or the financing or the basically just the distribution of the content. And so those windows that have shortened and the amount of money that can be made in those smaller periods of time, and those larger periods of time, depending on how you want to think about it, or the different mediums in which the content can be distributed, there creates more exposure from partners of the content that's being disseminated. You have to think about how those different parties might be upset by something not performing well, or by a film that was originally supposed to go to theatrical release that got released directly to a streaming app because of the pandemic. How does that change your exposure in terms of the financial impact upon the third parties associated with the production?
Do you think it made things worse generally, or has it made things better?
I think it's a net, right? There's less money being made in the theatrical space for the smaller productions, but they have more opportunities on the streaming side. They could have Netflix for a year, then they have Amazon for 6 months, then they have Stars for another 6 months. There's more different places. People have different subscriptions and they're waiting to see that content. I know I have a bunch of films lined up that I want to see once they pop up onto one of the ones that I actually subscribe to.
So it sounds like the deadly sins never change, but it's just the way that people can now experience them are slightly different.
Exactly.
And on that content side, obviously we had the strike, so you couldn't have named productions, you couldn't have big fiction,
right?
Screen-written productions. So did it mean you went into a lot more non-fiction, and did that change the risk profile at all?
So we've always had a large book of documentaries and reality television shows. So it didn't change our profile so much from that perspective, but it changed our competitors' profiles where they had to pivot and try and make sure they hit their growth goals by writing those. And it may not have been within their comfort zone. So it became everyone was a little bit more interested in different types of productions.
I suppose something that's a documentary and really purporting to be it's effectively journalism or trying to be, historical fact, then I suppose it's generating exposure. It's more likely to create some kind of dispute, someone to say, well, actually, you've purported this to be fact and that fact is not correct. That kind of thing, or the way you portrayed me is not correct, especially when you're portraying it as being, reality.
Yeah, the vetting of documentaries is incredibly important in terms of establishing that the points you're making are rooted in fact and that you double source something, just like traditional journalism, right? Truth is an ultimate defense to defamation. Doesn't necessarily protect us from paying defense costs, but it's important to underwrite to the integrity of the producers, the integrity of their clearance partners, the integrity of the individuals that they're interviewing.
Yeah.
And that all gets brought in.
Certainly something being true doesn't stop them suing you for libel and making you incur a huge amount of defense costs, even though it's completely true. We can prove it to be true, but then it can be very expensive just saying this is true. And even to the point where you could offer to say sorry, even though you have no reason to do so. Even then they won't go away because they're so annoyed with you that you published something that was true about them, but they just didn't like it. Not to say I'm speaking from bitter experience, but potentially, yes. It's just the ticket to entry in the game in some way. If you're an important publication and if the whole industry reads you, then you've got to be very careful what you say. But sometimes, no matter how careful you are, people are going to be unhappy anyway. So you can't do the job without making somebody unhappy, particularly in reality journalism. You can't really avoid it at some point because it's almost like you're not doing your job properly if you haven't done it.
Yes. Well, I mean, that's where the insurance comes in, right? It's because of that unknown. It's because of that large driver of defense costs. Defamation and copyright infringement are very emotion-driven lawsuits, right? I mean, especially in the creative work side, from an IP perspective, it's you took my dream, my idea, this thing that I was planning my whole life around, my whole ability to create a franchise out of some characters I created. And then on the defamation side, it's you accuse me of committing a crime that I didn't commit, right? Or that you exaggerated it or you reported it too early. It's affecting people's personal lives.
Let's talk in general now, Danielle. It's what's been fascinating about the last 4 years, 5 years, has been a shift out of admitted lines into excess and surplus lines, E&S. What do you think is behind that? And some elements of that, some people would say that they're just cyclical. These are things that happen. This has coincided with a hardening in the market generally, and that business will ebb and flow, that some of that business that goes out to the E&S market will come back into the admitted market when the market softens or when that admitted market regains some of the appetites that it's lost. Where do you stand on this? Do you think a lot of it's a secular trend, or is it just a cyclical thing that's happened? Because there's certainly been a very significant increase in volumes in business going into excess and surplus lines.
So I think part of it is cyclical, but I do think that there was a shift that not everything will go back when the cycle changes again. I think a large part of it is that the risk around cyber, the risks around new technologies, they're so fast-paced and volatile that the ability to be able to move rate and form the way you can in the E&S market is very, very important to certain lines of business that need to absorb that volatility. We have to have insurance for that volatility, but in many ways, the only way carriers can get enough comfort is to do it on an E&S basis. I think that along with the few ransomware years and then some post-pandemic years, that hard market pushed a lot of maybe smaller, or even some media to E&S that didn't necessarily need to go there. It was just a hard market. So let's do it. I think that stuff will come back, but I do feel like anything driven by some of the new emerging technologies where you've got that volatility or just that fast-paced movement, the risk is changing so quickly that carriers have made the turn and said, we have to be able to move just as quickly in terms of rate and form.
So do you think that some of these are just because these risks, they're permanently changed and they're permanently more complicated and obviously more fast moving than they used to be? And that's why they'll stay out in the E&S world?
I do. And I think we'll continue to see more change and more evolution.
And you see that within your own book. Are you more an E&S underwriter than an admitted lines underwriter these days?
I think we're probably 50-50, but there are certain cyber and large E&O risk where E&S on sort of the small MPL where it's just E&O, really homogenous type of a risk. We can stay admitted and be really comfortable staying admitted. A lot of the media, particularly the entertainment stuff, is admitted.
And MPL's management practices liability?
Miscellaneous professional. Miscellaneous, but certain industries that we focus on really homogenous and we stay to the small end. So I think that's also a driver, right? Revenue. Large risks tend to really lend themselves to E&S, where small risks
just need a bigger limit. I presume the bigger the limit, the more likely it's have to go to E&S anyway.
Yeah, or they're looking for some specific type of language, whatever drives that large risk. Yep.
Obviously, you're in the heart of Casualty as a business unit. We're in the middle of a really broad debate about casualty and rate adequacy across all casualty lines, almost across the planet, but particularly in the US. Where do you stand on that debate in terms of where we are? How adequate are rates today for the risks we're facing today? Maybe we can put aside how adequate reserves and rates were in the past. But yeah, where are we now? Because casualty classes being long tail, they've got the most inherent volatility, that if you get it a tiny bit wrong, you can end up being very wrong in 7 years' time. And you're finally paying off the last few losses. So I suppose inherently, the longer the tail, the more there is to talk about and the more is to debate about within pricing, that debate about adequacy. But when you're having your debate with your brokers, where are you standing at the moment?
So I think for QBE's book, I think we're comfortable where we are. For the market overall, in some lines, there was a correction or a supposed correction over the last couple of years, and now we're on the downturn for a bunch of those lines. Where that downturn ends, I think, is kind of the debate. But for us, I think that carriers have different levers to pull in terms of what's rate adequate for them. Carriers with larger books and maybe smaller expense loads can deal with rate in a way different than a startup with a high expense load and a small book of business. So I think the overall market doesn't see the internal dynamics at each of the carriers, and we tend to sort of ride the wave. And so at QBE, for us, we're really focused on our book. What are our levers? And from a rate adequacy perspective, if the market goes too far down, in some lines, you may say it's already there. In some of the lines for professional liability, it's pushing in that direction. If it goes too far down, we just have to take a pause and say, we're feeling like we're adequate. And if we can't continue to keep rate where we need it to be, then we'll have to pivot. And luckily, we have a pretty diverse book. And rate isn't always doing the same thing in all of our sectors, so we can manage that. Overall, I think the market, it does its cycles. We've seen this movie before and we'll see it again.
In some ways, if you're meeting unmet demand, there's still a lot of underinsurance, even in the US, in some of these classes. if you can keep getting new business, it's probably less important. Is that right? Do you think you can still keep growing if you're selling new business to people who haven't bought before?
I think we can keep growing. I think we have done a few unique things. We have a unique offering in the market, so we can continue to grow and not have to become very commoditized, which is where the driver for the rate decreases goes. If everybody's selling the exact same product and the only thing you can compete on is price, the price is going to go down.
Something that we've been talking about, I had Serene Davis on the program recently, your global head of cyber. And since actually I had Andrew Horton on the program about 15 months ago, the idea of globalizing your offerings internationally, and also the idea of a lot of interdepartmental collaboration in what you're doing. How are you fitting in with this change of emphasis, Danielle?
I think our team fits in great. We actually really embrace it and like it a lot. So having a global cyber offering helps us in the US. So it helps our team on the ground to say that we have a consistent approach to how we look at cyber. And so if we've got a customer who needs something from us, but they also want to work with our UK colleagues for some reason, that ease to get stuff done globally is really important. And it brings another lever for us. Just getting to be able to talk to folks around the globe and what they're seeing and what we might be coming down the pike for us, or are they seeing what we're seeing in the US and adapting it for what they're doing? It's really important. It's a knowledge sharing that hasn't happened before at QBE as much as it should have. And now it is, and it's going to help us be better going forward. From a media perspective, cyber is the one that everybody thinks about and everyone's talked about. But from a media perspective, Chris is doing some of that as well.
I suppose something like cyber is completely horizontal, isn't it? And we've all got cyber exposure. Even if we're just down to individuals, we could all benefit from some kind of cyber cover, I'm sure. But on the ground, how do you actually incentivize? And it's easy sometimes for people right at the top to say, hey, I want everyone to be friends and talk to each other. And maybe you do some kind of away day and you get to know some people. And then you go back to your desk and then you've got your 23 things that have all been brewing away while you've been away on this away day. And you come back and you kind of snowed under. And by the end of that week, you've thought, oh, I haven't actually done any collaborating with anybody. How do you actually incentivize that and make sure it actually happens?
Yeah, so I think our media liability book and our cyber book have been really great examples of cross-team collaboration. We really only started writing very large media companies several years ago. And the impetus for us being able to compete in that marketplace was an expanded cyber appetite. So we decided early on that we would approach the marketplace with a combined media expert and cyber expert approach, where we used our long expertise and relationships with large media companies, as well as our cyber expertise, to be able to have two different underwriters focusing on those two different coverages. And by rewarding and creating the right culture for that type of collaboration, there was no incentive to split who gets credit for the cyber versus the media, or who is the person getting it attached to their name. The way that we've made everyone feel like we're creating the right results for our department within QBE gives them the culture, the motivation to want to work together, to want to talk to each other, to want to ask for help, to want to include two other QBE people, to want to include the claims team on it, because it enhances what we bring to the marketplace. The client, the insurance buyer, and the broker who wants to look good in front of their client really appreciate having the expertise across the board, whether it's the claim side, the cyber side, the media liability underwriting side, the technology E&O side. That reward you get from winning that business, seeing how that approach really works, has incentivized our underwriters to really work together along with all the other components of the organization.
It seems to make a huge amount of sense with cyber and media liability because they've got large exposures on both sides, and obviously they need both, and they'd probably rather not have to go and have two policies or two meetings to get that need met.
Yeah. Media liability is not a product that exists in a lot of parts of the world. There's professional indemnity coverage for professionals, there's cyber, but there's very few carriers who can write media liability in many places of the world. And there's even fewer who would focus on individual productions or individual podcasts. We've done a lot of work with our local QBE offices throughout the world to try and get them to see the video and film marketplace as something that is viable. And we've done that because we have a lot of United States multinational conglomerate media companies who have local operations in these countries. And we've been able to build out a multinational product that will insure individual films in those local jurisdictions. And the underwriting, is collaborative between the United States and the local QBE office. So we're issuing a local policy attached to a master policy and sort of creating an idea, a spark within those local countries that this is something that is profitable, that there is expertise to bring in that marketplace. And there is a need because you're global conglomerates, we're insuring their local subsidiaries, but those conglomerates are hiring third parties or they are buying films from those local marketplaces and they are requiring media liability of those entities and they cannot buy it. Those local entities cannot buy it outside of sort of like the conglomerate's local subsidiary. So it's creating potentially a seed for that marketplace to sort of grow. And that's a good example of how beyond the global cyber offering, how QBE is really working together to try and find other solutions for the clients.
That certainly chimes with me because I became a media liability customer and buyer because I was required to. I was going through a new supplier process for somebody and I suddenly realized that, there was a section in the form that asked me how much liability insurance I had. And, I had to go and get some.
Right.
Danielle, so in terms of incentivizing people, I think Andrew Horton spoke about rewarding people's behaviors, certainly, or looking at people's behavior rather than just the numbers. Is that more how it works? So when you're reviewing people, you're looking at how well they've played in the sandpit with everybody else, just as much as how well they've done on production?
Yes, that is a key part of the shift in our culture. So those are the behaviors that we want. We call it's part of our QBE DNA. And so managers are looking for that within the team. But to Chris's point about although that work that on the multinational, that's work he's doing, right? For a leader of his stature at QBE to spend the time to actually do that shows the team that that's really important to us. So when Andrew Horton is talking about this and he's pushing it down to his leadership team and they're pushing it down to the next level leaders, the leaders really have to show the way. And so we're all about collaborating and trying to work across lines so that those folks on our team see that that is valued behavior. If I'm doing it every day, if Chris is doing it every day, that's valued behavior. And it's not just when you come up for your performance review, we're going to tick a box and say, yeah, you met your behaviors and you met your production, go along on your way. We like to say, if it's good for QBE, then it's good for me. It's about walking the walk. So if the leaders are walking the walk, then those who are following them are going to walk the walk.
We parked this earlier on because it's very hard not to talk about AI these days. On the underwriting side, Danielle, how are you embracing it? How are you incorporating this AI? And I suppose which parts of the value chain are you looking to use it most? And obviously there's a lot being used for ingestion of all the unstructured things that brokers send you and turning them into something that's useful that you can put into a rating engine or you can at least put into your systems in structured form. Or there are lots of other places where you can have a look, obviously, to analyze that data to then come up with a price, all sorts of other things. How far do you think AI will go and how much autonomy will it have in the end? Looks like at the moment, most people are using it like a very smart underwriting assistant who's going to get all your stuff in order, but you're not going to give them the pen, digital pen.
We are using AI right now. We're using it for cyber submission flow. So it basically does exactly what you say. It takes all of the unstructured data that we get through our submissions, and it helps us put it into a risk assessment and collate those submissions and prioritize them. But that's as far as it goes now. The underwriter is checking everything. The underwriter is the one who is making all decisions. We haven't gotten to a point where I would even say that it's a great underwriting assistant yet, but it has helped us move more quickly, and we see a lot of value in it for the future. We're only 6 months in to using it.
Early judgment is presumably it's good for productivity if it's triaging your inflow and kind of sorting out a lot of time-consuming stuff for you.
Yes, it's definitely great for our productivity and efficiency. So I think we will continue to use it as much as we can. But as far as autonomy, I feel like it's a little bit of a new tool right now to be able to be talking about autonomy. I would love for it to get to a place where it's a good underwriting assistant, but I don't see it taking the place of an underwriter judgment anytime soon.
And I suppose it's all about incremental steps, isn't it? And then we're on the first step. So we'll wait a decade before we start letting it run off and do its own thing.
Yeah, and we have to be cognizant of all the regulation in the US that's coming out.
If the NAIC says it's not allowed, then it's just not allowed. So you're not doing it.
Yeah, and we're going to have a patchwork just like we did for privacy. All the different states are going to say different things about how it can be used. So that's something that we have to watch too as we continue to develop our tool.
So we'll have to use AI to automate all the compliance we're going to have to run into. Yeah. Chris, I want to ask you a question now about on the other side, on the risk side of things. And I thought I might as well ask you because you're the media guy. As a specialist in that field and in a very specialist field, how do you view AI itself as a potential peril? And obviously a systemic one as well. Are you worried about, we've read things about sort of artists being unhappy with whatever DALL-E has ingested, all that kind of stuff. And we've seen some preliminary cases being filed and things happening. Why don't you fill me in on that in terms of what you feel it is as an underwriter, as a peril itself?
I get asked this question a lot from our insured partners because they're sort of looking for guidance. What should we be using it for? How should we be advising our staff? And I don't know that I have the right answer. I feel like if I had the right answer, I'd probably own an AI company myself and be making a lot more money. But it's sort of like any new emerging peril. You approach things with care. At its core, it's a tool. It's a tool that they can utilize to help create content more efficiently. That efficiency comes at a cost of accuracy or potential breaching of other people's intellectual property. But the core exposure comes down to still understanding whether or not that content is original, whether or not it's fact-based, having a real person review that content before it goes out. And the advice that I've given like in-house general counsel is that I don't know the right policy that you should write for your employees, but have one, stick to it, train them, discipline them, have consequences, and stay abreast of what the updates are. I mean, there are a lot of bills pending in state legislatures that could have impact upon how they operate or how they create content or disseminate content within those particular jurisdictions. That's a big mouthful. So it's a tool in my mind. I think from an emerging exposure perspective, a lot of the state bills, coupled with the recent guild agreements, I think you're going to see an increase in claims arising out of the use of name or likeness. It's right of publicity exposure. It's built into a media liability underwriter's DNA to understand that stuff. But the ease in which that can now happen and the autonomy, I guess, is perhaps the right word, of the AI engine to potentially create something that looks like someone else or sounds like someone else or incorporates the mannerisms of someone else who's right to make a profit off of their personality. It may be difficult for the reviewers of that content to know that this is using the likeness of someone else, that it is using the voice of someone else, that this voice sounds too much like Tom Waits, right? Maybe that's a bad example. He's pretty distinct.
Well, that's a cool voice, yeah. And
Yeah.
I'd like to sound like Tom Waits. Well, I probably do, yeah, after if I've been out on the tiles
Yeah,
the night before.
exactly. So that right of publicity, that use of name and likeness exposure is kind of where I am watching it most carefully from a media liability underwriting perspective. There are pending cases about the viability of the content input into the engines overall. I don't know where that's going to land. We will see. I don't think it will have a tremendous impact on how we underwrite. It could hurt or help defenses for fair use. That's to be determined. From a professional liability perspective overall, I think AI is the same thing. It's a tool that has to be monitored, that has to be any law firm that's using it, any consultant that's using it, any franchisor that's using it needs to have a standard policy and practice in place for its employees to follow for the use of generative AI. Whether it's drafting a brief, the information in that AI generated brief has to be double checked by an associate or partner. We've seen several sanctions against firms or penalties against firms that just took the AI for its word. But yeah, it's a tool that eventually will lead to claims because the employees at the insureds are going to become too comfortable. They're going to trust it too much. They're going to think it's so easy. It knows what it's doing. It's been around for so long, and they're going to get comfortable and they're going to get sloppy. And that's where E&O claims are going to come in. It's just another avenue for them to make mistakes. And so that policy at the GC level on down and have the training in place is really, really important.
Sounds really good, Chris. It sounds just like, again, you're talking about the 7 deadly sins. They're always there. We just find new ways of making them come out. So
exactly,
getting sloppy, that's the definition of E&O, isn't it? It's
correct.
Well, thank you both of you. I've really enjoyed our conversation. It's been very broad and far-reaching. Maybe we spread ourselves a bit too thin. I don't know. But I've realized that we're coming up to the end of our allotted time. So it only remains for me to thank both of you for spending time with the Voice of Insurance. And thanks so much for your time. I've really enjoyed it.
Thank you, Mark. It was a pleasure.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Well, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you did, don't forget to subscribe or leave a like or a review or recommendation on whatever podcast platform you used to access this program. These really help get the word out. Before we go, just a quick reminder that advertising slots are available here and in other places in the Voice of Insurance podcasts. Podcasting is the fastest growing medium and attracts a high quality audience of key decision makers. It's also an intimate medium where you, the listener, are right in the room with me and the interview subjects. Needless to say, that means it's a great way of getting your message out directly to an audience because you know you've got their full attention. It's also very cost effective. So get in touch with Mark at thevoiceofinsurance.com to find out how you could be speaking directly to the industry. The Voice of Insurance is produced in association with Advantage Go. Release your underwriters to underwrite with Advantage Go's underwriting platform. Voice of Insurance is produced by me, Mark Gagan. Music was written by Anna Gagan and produced by Carlos Gagan. Check out more podcasts and written comment pieces at www.thevoiceofinsurance.com.